Well, good morning, everybody. How nice to see you all so bright and early. Hardly a cornflake crumb on the lips and only one person in pyjamas. It couldn't be better. Shame about missing a port of call, but it does give an opportunity for me to slot in an extra talk, which from my point of view is always fun. I, for many years, have been protesting about the way in which education isn't keeping pace with the realities of the world. And were I to say to you, raise your hand if you agree with me, I guess almost every hand, in fact probably two hands in some cases, would go up all around the world. I mean, I saw this headline in a national newspaper some years ago, making the point that you don't have to be able to spell or be literate to go out and sell things. Well, I don't hold this view. There is a view in the English teaching fraternity, and it's not the teacher's responsibility to say this, it's always the education ministry or the government who lay down these things, that spelling and grammar should not inhibit the marking of free expression. Well, that may be, but I can promise you that none of those ministers or government officials would send their child for surgery to a brain surgeon who spelt it B-R-A-N-E. It just doesn't work. They also argue that kids can't take too much information and that you can't stress them too much when they're young. And yet, generations ago, when things were happening at an extraordinary rate, that was the case. Kids were expected to stretch their brains and to be made uncomfortable by the speed of learning. I mean, we think to ourselves how wonderful this modern era is, with everything happening and changing at an extraordinary rate. But it has done for centuries. Go back into the 1800s when in Britain they started laying down railways, and suddenly you had a situation, just imagine this, we fantasize about beam me up Scotty, but this was the next best thing. Railways were suddenly built all over the country. And within a few decades, people who'd spent their whole lives living within an easy horse ride of the village where they were born could sit down in relative comfort and end up hundreds of miles away. It's extraordinary. The coming of electricity, the invention of the telegraph, the fact that you could suddenly send a message from New York to San Francisco without it taking 3 weeks. It is amazing how change has always happened in the past. And it isn't the case that kids cannot possibly endure intensive education. They can. Look at this from 1897. Give an account of the position and general structure of the liver. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing for kids to answer today? Where does most of the blood supply in the liver come from? Draw a map of the west coast of England and Wales. I could kind of sketch it, but I couldn't draw a map. And I'm 84. This was for kids of 16, ladies and gentlemen. Determined by geometrical construction forces which, together with a number of given forces, will keep a particle in equilibrium. You'd think that that was from some advanced physics course in a university, but no, it was in a school examination. And just look at the difference that you get in a century. On a steamer which is moving at the velocity of 15 miles an hour, a man crosses the deck in a direction at right angles. You remember these questions. Now you look at the more modern version. When Bill moored his yacht, he found it was rocked by the waves. Explain why it always returned to the upright position. I mean, this is childish simplicity compared to what kids used to have to understand. 1894. Give an account of the geographical conditions which may give rise to regions of excessive rainfall and to regions of excessive drought. I mean, that's the kind of thing which these days, with global warming, we need to understand. But the modern part, 1994, its present-day equivalent, or its recent equivalent, the rainfall at Keswick is more than double the average rainfall in time. Suggests why. It's quite obvious on the map. It's rain shadow. We all know that. But we don't demand the mental rigor from kids these days that we once did. Look at that, draw an outline map of Europe. Not only that, but mark the chief rivers and the chief ranges of mountains. I don't think, well, forgive me, I don't want to insult anybody, any ardent geographer lurking in the audience, but I don't think any of us could do that. But a kid of 16 was expected to then. I find these comparisons quite overwhelming. And look at that. This incredibly complicated, yet entirely understandable question about profit in 1947. By the time it came to 1997, you only have to work out what is the percentage profit. Things have been dumbed down for years. And yet educational authorities keep telling the teachers, no, they haven't, just do what you're told. There were reports, we have in England the A-levels, those are the exams sat at the age of 18. And the exam boards were actually told to deliberately mark them down. It is perfectly obvious that you need to go to school to learn the things you want in adult life, but we don't do it. We submerge children with all sorts of stuff from algebra through to Shakespeare, which they need to know about, but which they don't need to study for years and years on end. Look at that. We're aiming to improve education because if school leavers put in job applications full of errors, it's going to have a bad effect on their careers. You actually need a spokesman to tell you a thing like that. And have a look at this one. Graham Zellick said that more than half of the undergraduates simply shouldn't be at university. More than half of the people. University has become a con. When I went to university, and when my children went to university, nobody paid for university education in Britain. It was education. It was meant to create a generation of people who'd have good jobs, earn a lot of money, and correspondingly, of course, pay a lot of tax. But then the Labour government under Tony Blair introduced paying for university education, which had always been the question, the state of affairs anyway in the United States. And suddenly kids were going to university. And what now happens is this. They leave school, they go to university, they then apply for grants from the grant-giving authorities. They're actually loans, of course, and they command surprisingly high levels of interest. They spend 3 or 4 years doing their degree. They end up the best part of $100,000 in debt, with a qualification, which often means they've learnt very little, and that's when they start their careers. It's just completely wrong. They're not actually paying for their tuition, they're paying to run the entire university. They are paying to run all of the research that goes on. Of course, there are grants given for the research as well, but you've got little teenagers sent off to go and borrow money, which they hand over to their alma mater. And meanwhile, of course, the universities put on a great front of showing how wonderfully academic and solid they are. I do like this memo, that the grants committee will be visiting the department. And so what does everybody have to do? All laboratories are to be cleared up, but you mustn't give the impression that anything has been done to tidy up the place. All research workers are asked to work in the laboratory simulating feverish activity. And finally, the intention is that we give the impression of being a highly productive university department. I won't say which professor published that, because I think Professor Tobias of Birmingham would be very upset if I did. But it does make you realize that much of it is show and not reality. And this I saw at the University of Cambridge, where I have a lot of attachments. This was a notice pinned up on the board by a postgraduate. This is somebody who's got their degree, they have their degree, and they are reminding Delargates to come to tomorrow's misspelt and mispunctuated conference. I took a photograph of that. I thought, got to show that to audiences. This is at Cambridge University, one of the handful at the top in the whole world. This is a person who has their degree and is now reading for a later one. And the result is, of course, that we now have a situation where everywhere you look, there is nonsense, nonsense, nonsense. Let me give you that quote from a letter sent around by the Serco organization, who were taking over the control of education at Bradford. And they thought they would endear themselves to everybody by sending out a letter personally to all of the Board of Governors. So they sent it out. Dear Governor, they said, misspelt. Wherever you look, you see the results of modern education. And I find it quite extraordinary that we're stuck in this situation. Here's one from a book by Fiona Reynolds, saying that new antibiotics don't work against these new viruses. Viruses have never been affected by antibiotics. And this is in a textbook. It's not a little mistake, it's not a typo, it's a statement. This is a book people are going to get and learn from. And when you look in the books, you will find time and time again that the same errors are carried on, because you may not realize this, but when encyclopedias are compiled, they don't get their information from the real world. They get their information by copying facts from other books. And what you publish has got to fit what everybody else has published. Here's a great example. You may remember this experiment from school. And when I was a kid of about 13 and saw this, I raised my hand and I said, this experiment makes no sense at all. What happens is that you light a candle, you put a bell jar over the candle, and then as the candle flame burns and dies and sputters and eventually goes out, the water rises up about a fifth of the way to the top. And the teacher triumphantly says, this proves that 1/5 of the air is oxygen. So I raised my hand and I said, that can't possibly be right. And the teacher said, why? I said, well, firstly, because the flame isn't going to burn until the last atom of oxygen is used up. The flame is going to burn until there's not much oxygen left. Secondly, you started off with air in the bell jar. You've now got hot air and smoke. It doesn't make any sense at all. And the teacher said, as teachers always did, well, I'm constrained. It's in the book. And this is what we have to learn. And everywhere you go, you see people teaching the same thing. We went to a medieval fair to see this alchemist character. And there he is, making the same demonstration and giving the same explanation. You light the candle, you put a little flask over the top of it, and as you watch, the flame goes smaller and sputters and suddenly extinguishes with a little wisp of smoke. And he says, this proves that 1/5 of the atmosphere is oxygen. I went in Kuala Lumpur, and here is an Islamic technician doing the same demonstration and making exactly the same answer, giving exactly the same interpretation of what's happening. But it's an absolute nonsense. The fact that it's about 1/5 is a pure coincidence. And yet all around the world kids are taught this, and any child who doubts it is reminded by the teacher, who of course is entirely constrained by whatever the official policy is, that this is what we have to learn. And then I had my chance. An English publisher rang up and said that they actually sent me this proof of the jacket of my first Encyclopedia of Science. They hadn't even mentioned to me they'd like me to write it, but they went to the trouble of actually setting up and printing the jacket and sending it to me and saying, we would like to contract you to write a book on science for the pre-teens. And this is what the jacket would be like. And I was so flattered, I thought, well, how kind of them. On the other hand, I then realized that they had invested quite a lot in doing this, so I was able to sting them from a larger than normal sum of money in advance. And I thought, one thing I'm going to correct is the atom. Whenever you see atoms in books, they're always billiard balls. There's the billiard balls in the nucleus, the proton and the neutron, and there are the billiard ball electrons whizzing around. And if you turn open any book, you always find these bloody billiard ball electrons. Now, since the dawn of the quantum era, we have known that whatever electrons are, they're not billiard balls. And so I had a word with the graphic artist and said, let's show them as, we've got to show them as orbiting because it's in all the books, but let's show them as little sort of fizzy particles of energy. And the artist came up with this and said, how's that? And I said, well, yeah, that'll do. So I said to the publishers, we're going to replace the billiard ball electron and the billiard ball nucleus. And the publisher said, well, that's fine, you're correcting a lot of mistakes as you go along. This is wonderful. I said, this book is going to revolutionize the way that the young see science. When the page proofs came, I noticed that the atom page proof was missing. And I said, one of the pages in this batch you sent isn't there. He said, the atom. He said, yes, that's with the American publishers. You'll get it later. And when it came, they were on the point of printing, and this was the atom that they had published. Those bloody billiard balls had come back. And I said, hang on a second. I was determined that my encyclopedia of science was not going to have those sodding billiard balls. And he said, yes. But as Random House pointed out, and as we have realized too, every other encyclopedia has got them showing as billiard balls. So if we don't do it, people would think we're wrong. And I said, no, we're right. They're all wrong. And he said, yes, but it's in all the books. However, he said, we really can't change it as we're up against our publishing schedule. And there is one small consolation. And I said, what's that? He said, you can be entirely satisfied that we have made major changes, because in the history of publishing about the atom, your balls are going to be the smallest balls ever. And so that's how it appeared in print. Meanwhile, you do come across the fact that often kids longing to benefit their brains don't get the education they need. And that was actually published as a complaint against erring parents. And indeed, on occasion, I've talked about this on television. For decades and decades it's come up.
As they move into those new worlds, they'll meet the recurring debate whether the GCSE exams that they've faced have resulted in a lowering of standards.
This is a GCSE paper from this summer. It shows a diagram of a leaf. The students have to fill in these 3 boxes. One of the answers has already been completed. This is an exam paper from 1946. It shows the same diagram of a leaf. The students sitting this O-level paper had to label all the parts. Brian Ford, an academic who's been campaigning for improved standards in science exams, says these papers just aren't hard enough. Today's kids, he claims, are missing out in their education.
Children are working very hard and they're struggling to get through their exams, and they're trying to keep up with what it is that they're taught. But a young child said to me the other day, having sat these very GCSEs, I said to her, "Did you enjoy school, Becky?" And she said, "Well, yes, it was a great place to go. A wonderful play school atmosphere, but they never really taught me anything I needed to know." What a condemnation of the system that is, and that's from the mouth of a child.
But the pass rate has increased, and the claim made by the government is that GCSEs and all other examinations should be accessible to a wider range of students, rather than a preserve of the intellectually elite.
And that's really the point. There is a feeling, there is an actual belief, and that last statement I find very revealing. There is a belief that you don't want to make examinations seem too hard because you want everybody to pass. You don't dare say to a child you failed. You have to praise everybody whether they failed or not. And that is what has actually happened in education. And the problem is that in order to try and make sure that you gratify everybody and please all the kids, instead of allowing some to pass and some to fail, you try and encourage everybody to get a pass. And from my point of view, the most vivid way of demonstrating this would be for me to give you a set of exam papers as they might have changed over the decades. So let's go right back to 1982 and look at a typical question as it might have been then. A logger sells a truckload of timber for 100 quid. Its cost of production is 4/5 of the price. What is his profit? We all agree that that was a perfectly reasonable kind of question to ask. Let's jump forward a decade. A logger sells a truckload of timber for £100. Its cost of production is 80% of the price.
which is £80, what is his profit? Now we have to crank forward another 10 years. A logger sells a truckload of timber for £100, his cost of production is £80. Did he make a profit? We'll come forward another decade, shall we? A logger sells a truckload of timber for £100, his cost of production is £80, and his profit is £20. Underline the number 20. We'll come forward another decade. Now we're close to the present day. A logger cuts down a beautiful forest because they're inconsiderate. Notice not he is inconsiderate, but they are inconsiderate, and cares nothing for the preservation of the environment. They do this so they can make a profit of £20. What do you think of this greedy and selfish way of making a living? Describe how you imagine the little birds and poor squirrels feel as the logger cuts down their homes. So then, we are now in the era of AI, which allows us to predict things. So I said, this is how the questions have gone in the past, looking at the way in which the world is now changing, and the way in which the balance of power is changing. What will that question be like in another decade? And this came up as the answer. Now, for a long time, I've been trying to say to people that we need to rethink education and make it more relevant. And a number of those topics came up. We're going to go back 30 years to a television programme on Britain's national news.
Well, what about those industrial complaints about Britain's youngsters lacking basic skills and the 50,000 pupils who fail to achieve any passes at all? Well, joining me in the studio is Brian J. Ford, former director of Mensa, who reckons that all children would benefit from more inspirational teaching. Brian, of course, the exam that we now know as the GCSE descended from the Cambridge board exam in the 1850s. Right. In those days, the questions really were pretty formidable, weren't they, by comparison?
They were. I mean, here's the original 1858 paper. Geography. Draw a map of Great Britain and mark on the principal river basins. Draw an outline map of Hindustan. Draw an outline map of Europe and trace upon it the dotted line of its watershed. I can't draw Europe without copying it from a map, and I don't suppose you can either, Laurie.
But there were also more interesting questions, weren't there?
Some of them, when you read the modern papers, I mean, this is this year's Southern Examining Board paper, they're very terse, they're very bossy, they're very detached. But there's a sense of fun and an enjoyment of intellectualizing. In this early paper, for example, explain as you would to a child the cause of day and night. Can you assign a reason for supposing A, that the Earth moves on its axis, and B, that it's not stationary in the heavens? Now, that's the kind of question, particularly in this space age, that youngsters would love to tackle today.
So what you're really saying is, because questions have become more boring, that there's no sort of challenge in learning anymore?
There isn't. When kids go to the infant school, they usually adore it. They're very happy to go to primary school. But these modern, massive, bureaucratized comprehensives bore children to death. There's a huge rates of truancy. Kids don't like going to school. If you were giving them questions on how you organise a pop concert, classes on how you become a stand-up comedian, courses on how you insure your flat, how you choose a home, how you raise a family, all these things, kids would be busting their nuts to get to school. If I ran schools, the first item on today's curriculum would have been analysing the new Oasis album. Things that kids want to know about and would be excited to have a teacher explain.
And would that mean that we wouldn't see 50,000 children getting nothing at all?
I find that terrifying. The real thing that bothers me is that they've now lowered standards so much so that everybody gets a piece of paper that I can't see how kids don't. In the 1989 science paper, they had a drawing of a tripod, a drawing of a Bunsen burner, and a drawing of a flask. And the question was, write the name out of each of these bits of apparatus.
Wow.
You don't have to go to school to know things like that.
So why has this sort of dumbing down come about?
Because people want to be able to say, our school has got an increased number of passes from last year. Governments want to be able to say, more people than ever have got higher grades than ever. The only way that they've done that is to lower the standards. What I'd like to see would be the standards kept, but kids excited by the principle of learning so that they actually gained more knowledge.
But there is a glimmer of light, isn't there, briefly, Brian, because people are now talking about replacing the A-levels with a baccalaureate. It's going to be a much broader and hopefully more stimulating sort of exam.
Yes, but only if it really is. After all, we renamed all the polytechnics universities, but we didn't really change what goes on there. There is a danger in feeling that if you rename a problem, the problem goes away. What I'm saying is that we have to grasp the problem and solve it first.
Brian, I hope you get your school soon. Thank you very much for joining us.
Now there's a good example. That was in 1995. And you notice that Laurie Mayer said how he'd heard that we were going to introduce a baccalaureate in England as a sort of general certificate of education. The week or so before we came away on this cruise, the government was talking about whether they might consider introducing a baccalaureate instead of the standard exams. It's nearly 30 years later, and nothing has happened. We have a situation now where in schools, kids are quite likely to be taught about transsexuality, about masturbation, about homosexuality, and yet for decades nobody has ever taught kids how to be normal, everyday, grown-up people. There has been no course teaching boys how to be courteous and kind and constructive and courageous. There's never been a course teaching girls how to be creative and charismatic and caring. So we have a situation where we don't teach people how to grow up into people, but we're terribly quick to teach people about the occasional exceptions to the rule and the minority groups that we've also ignored. Now, I'm not for a moment saying we shouldn't ignore those. In my own family, you have almost every shade of sexual position on the sexual spectrum. My aunt, my dear Aunt Nell, the most influential person I had, she would have been a campaigner for transsexuality. In the 30s, she wore trousers and smoked a pipe, if you can imagine anything so brave and so outgoing and so confident and so campaigning as that. But why don't we teach kids how you've got to live in the adult world while they taught how you run a flat, how you book a cruise, why you should insure a holiday, how you fix a washing machine, how you change a plug, how you plant plants in your garden, how do you store strawberries, how do you bring up a child, how do you cook a meal, how do you decorate a room, how do you choose furniture. These are the things that kids need to know, and yet we sit them in school and we teach them algebra and Shakespeare. Now, I mentioned those examples before, and I have to tell you that in all my life as an adult scientist, I have not once used algebra. I'm not saying we decry algebra, but as it is, we teach kids exactly how to do it to an almost extraordinary level. Kids need to be taught about algebra, so if ever they need it, they know what it is and where to go to get it and how to do it. They need to know about Shakespeare. Shakespeare was a wonderful, gifted, perceptive, alliterative, and alluding writer. He was a terribly clever writer, and everybody would benefit from learning about Shakespeare. But when you take little kids and make them go right through A Midsummer Night's Dream and act all the parts and understand all the nuances and get it drilled into them, in Britain we're now saying kids must learn mathematics to the age of 18, whether the poor little buggers want to or not. I have to tell you, kids don't need mathematics. What they need is arithmetic. That, of course, they must have. But children don't need to sit and learn the details of calculus and algebra. Trigonometry is a great case in point. When I was young, we used to learn Euclidean geometry, which was full of reasonable ways of working out structures and solving recalcitrant problems. And I loved it because the whole reasoning, all the kids loved it. If A to B is so and so and C to D is so and so, proves that D to F must be greater than A. That kind of argument. And people say, no, we don't want to strain kids. We don't want to trouble their brains. We don't want to pressurize them. Oh no, well, go and see what the kids do. When they get onto their computer games, the computer games are full of problem solving, just like that. If you go into a bookshop, and you will find that amongst the books that are selling more than any other are books to the young full of puzzles and games. Kids need to have their brains stretched. Kids don't want people to dumb down learning so that everybody passes. They want to be challenged. If you go into a pub, and what are you likely to find but quiz machines? Quiz machines where questions come up and people earn money by knowing the answers. What is there going to be on this ship and in almost every pub in the world? Why? A trivia quiz. Because people know stuff and they want to prove that they know stuff. And there is fun in retrieving from the memory the stuff that you know. People are never satisfied when you dumb things down to such an extent that nobody anymore really learns anything. It's relevance. Almost everything we teach kids in school we don't need. Once you've been through school, you will go to university and learn medicine. Or you may go to college and study to be a lawyer. That's what everybody tends to aspire to, that kind of professional career with an academic basis. Left to me, you would start teaching law to kids when they were 7. You would start teaching anatomy to kids when they were 7. I doubt whether all of you are entirely confident where your pancreas is, or indeed what it does. But you should have known that before you were 10 years old. I don't think we teach kids in any way the things they need to know. What you have to do when you're an adult is live a life that's creative, that's compassionate, that generates benefit to other people, and just increases the enjoyment everybody has in the world around them. That's what you need to do, and it's the one thing that you're never taught. They say that kids go to university because they want to have their minds broadened, but we make one fundamental mistake. We confuse education and training. People act as though they're the same, but they're not. Training is from the Norman French, traîner, meaning to drag along behind, like a steam train or a bridle train, to pull in the given direction. Education, from the Latin, educare, to draw out, as in blossoming and flowering. We think kids go to university to train their brains, but they don't go to university to train their brains. Kids go to university because it's the least embarrassing way of leaving home. If you say to your parents, I'm going to move to another city, rent a flat, and start a job, they'd be on the phone to the relatives in floods of tears, saying we're being deserted, our child is walking out on us, what have we done wrong? The child comes to the parents and says they're going to the same town to go to university, and what do the parents do? They bring every relative they can think of and say, guess what? Our child is leaving home and going to university. Isn't it exciting? The reason kids go to university is because they want to play loud music, stay up all night, get laid, get high, get drunk, and not go to bed until dawn, which they can't do at home. And then 3 years later they end up with a piece of paper, and that's it. Except that they're heavily in debt. I am all in favour. I may say that when I was at university, I went to see my head of department. This is strictly between ourselves. And I said to him one day, I can't see that academia works the way it should. He said, how do you mean? I said, well, it seems to me that you study a certain thing. He said, yes. I said, you get a PhD. He said, right. I said, then when you're 99 years old, you're the world's greatest ever certain thingologist. And he said, exactly. And I said, but I don't want to do that. I might want to research one thing for 3 weeks and then turn to something else. I might want to do 2 things together. I might have a project that goes on for 10 years. I might have a project that is done in a weekend. And don't you think that if I'm studying something in, say, botany, that it might benefit from something that, say, in physics? And he said, no. That's why we have disciplines. You study a specific subject. And in fact, I left university before I completed my degree. And all the stuff I've had since has been on the basis of my published research work. And I've had wonderful freedom. Academics will come and look at my study and say, wow, I wish I had your freedom. And I smile inwardly and I think to myself, well, on Monday, you're going to be back in your crappy old office doing what the administrators tell you to do. I'm going to go and join Seabourn and cruise around the Med. So, who's right is what I say. Now, just listen to this.
A quarter of our school leavers at the moment leave without basic numeracy and literacy. I don't think that's right. Just if I
Now, that's the British Prime Minister. He just said, a quarter of our kids leave school without primary literacy. A quarter, 25%. If you look up online, somewhere like Wikipedia, what is the literacy and numeracy of an American, and there are the official figures, 100%. Look it up in Britain. What percentage of Britons are literate and numerate? And the answer is there, 100%. In fact, I looked into it, and the educational authorities in America say, no, it's 80%. 20% are not effectively literate and numerate. And here is the British Prime Minister saying, I'll play it again, a quarter of kids are not actually literate and numerate. 25%, he said. Just listen again.
A quarter of our school leavers at the moment leave without basic numeracy and literacy. I don't think that's right. Just if
A quarter of British kids leave school without literacy and numeracy. That was just last week. And in case you think, well, surely that can't be right, here's a great example. 2 days later, this news item appeared which said that the schools of Britain next year are going to get £50 per pupil less than the government promised. And why? Because the people in the military got their sums wrong. Even the educational authorities cannot get it right. So when the Prime Minister says a quarter of people can't, basically speaking, work out sums, he's perfectly correct. His own ministry can't. Now, I'm not pointing a specific political figure to British Prime Minister. Wherever you go around the world, you find this. Except, of course, in places like Asia, Singapore, China, Malaysia. Go to those countries, and the kids are learning. They've got little needle eyes, taking in every fact, passing every exam, striving to be better than all of their friends. If they don't pass, they fail. If they do pass, they move on to the next stage. It's unhealthily competitive, and the parents place great demands upon their children. But there's a sense of needing to better yourself. In the West, we're just coasting along, making things easy, and you have a situation where the British leader says that a quarter of people leaving school aren't literate and numerate, and his own Ministry of Education proves the point by not being capable of doing their own sums. I'm going to close with an example for you. Here is somebody who wrote a letter. He joined the police force. He left his job, joined the police force and signed up, and he then felt compelled to resign. And he wrote down the reasons for it. And I put in black the misspellings just for you to see. I was hoping for a profession, but I was given no intellectual credence, and I was severely denigrated in front of my fellow students. Particularly ingratiating was the attitude of my particular sergeants, who was supposed to impart relevant police law. This person, having written their letter of protest, went back to their job in school as head of a department of English. Ladies and gentlemen, please think on that. And meanwhile, until the next talk, thank you very much for coming today.